participants, welcome to the third module of week 9. In the previous discussions, we have seen how by the time we enter the 20th century, film as an independent yet still an interdependent art with literature has developed, and the debates against the proliferation of the medium of cinematic art has already started. It was basically viewed as a production of a mechanical age, an art which was hybrid, and therefore it necessarily combined technology with artistic imagination. It did borrow heavily from the existing art forms, particularly from the theatre as well as painting and photography. But very soon we find that within 100 years of its development, film as an art form has prospered further and has left behind all these different genres of art as far as the popularity and mass appeal is concerned. It also represents reality. The real version represents a reality, and at the same time it also has an all pervasive influence on the psyche and the imagination of the people. It is with this understanding that we move further to understand the relationship and the ambiguity of this relationship which exists between literature and film. There are different types of films. For example, there may be documentary films, films made only for educational purposes, only for advertisement purposes, news, experimental films, etc. However, as Maurice Beecher has rightly commented, it is a story film that is at the heart of the economy and artistic appeal of the film medium. We find that when Maurice Beecher has used these two terms simultaneously, economic and artistic, we have to understand the significance of the economic aspects of the medium in comparison to any other form of art. So, we find that the fusion of the story and cinema places film art in the continuing tradition of such narrative forms, and therefore, it comes very close to the novel as an art form. It can be compared with a folk tale, it can also be compared with an epic story. So, we find that it is the story based film which has the best market. The possibilities of marketability and consumerism are there as far as the story film is concerned, and at the same time we find that the possibilities of artistic expansions exist to its maximum capability. We also have to understand that whereas literature is an individualistic art form, the production of a literary piece, the process of writing any literary piece is highly individualistic. It does not have any space to accommodate any other person. The artist has to grapple with his or her own sensitivity to produce a poem or a story or rigorously work towards the completion of a novel. On the other hand, we find that film is a team effort. Even though we have talked about other angles, particularly the authorial angle substitute in terms of the director's vision, the auteur theory and perspectives towards the understanding of a film, we still find that it is a team spirit and the role of a director is still limited, and we find that the director's role is often limited to a unifying factor once a story has been completed by the team. So, we find that the film is closest to the novel as an art form. The narrative potential of the film is so marked that it has developed the strongest bond with the novel, not with painting and also not with theatre, the other two art forms with which it has maximum closeness. We find that the novel as well as a film tell a story with an eye to the detail, with a wealth of information, and it is narrated from the perspective of the narrator, and the audience or the viewer has to look at it and develop an understanding based on his or her own sensitivity. Whatever can be told in print in a novel is attempted to be reproduced in a movie with the help of certain special effects and with the help of certain traditions. When an individual reads a novel, the individual supplies the details and links on the basis of one's past experiences and imaginative capability, by also suspending the disbelief, as Coleridge has said. On the other hand, since these mental images are necessarily absent in the movie and everything has to be portrayed on the screen in front of the audience, so we find that it has also developed its own traditions to compensate for these lacunas. So, there are certain commonalities, as both are attempting to pass on a story convincingly to a viewer or to a reader, but still we find that there are several contrasts. The popularity of cinema is based on how well the image captivates the heart and the mind of the people. It is also supported by the melodies of the music, by the dialogues also, but ultimately we find that it is only the projection of the images which is superior to the dialogue delivery, and it is the visual appeal which ultimately helps the viewer to look at the images to lead an experience in a vicarious manner. The viewing of a film is based on the observation quality of a viewer as well as on the optical quality which has been presented by the filmmaker. The commonalities between the film and the novel are also based on the way certain characterizations are presented in both these art forms. And here I would once again refer to the 19th century novel and its impact on the earliest cinema. I would quote from a particular article by Sergei Eisenstein, where he has talked about Dickens, Griffith and the contemporary film scenario. Eisenstein has said that the Dickensian characters are rounded, but at the same time they are plastic and they are slightly exaggerated, so that the reader of a Dickensian novel remembers the quirkiness of the characters on the basis of the depictions. In the same manner, Eisenstein holds that the screen characters are also engraved in the memory of the viewer because of the clearly visible traits. For example, villains are often remembered by their certain facial expressions which the audience can relate to easily, saturated in the slightly unnatural gleam thrown over them by the screen. So, in a way we find that the quirkiness which is often projected for certain characters by a novelist can also be easily reproduced by the films, and in fact films have borrowed heavily from these realistic details of any character portrayal from the novels. When we talk about the form and substance and the interrelationship of these two forms, we find that the character as well as the substance are dependent on the nature of medium and the condition of communication. A film is a filmmaker's version of the real world, in the same manner in which a novel is a novelist's version of the world around it. However, the basic difference between these two art forms is introduced by the money which is required to project a film on a screen. A film's production as well as its marketing is heavily dependent on the economic affairs of the concerned people. It is very different from the scene of a novelist who can sit privately in a room and then write a novel or produce a short story. Since it is a team effort and the involvement of money is tremendous in the filmmaking scenario, we find that it is dependent on so many other people's efforts also, and therefore, the projection is often embellished with glamour and glitz. It is based on the manipulation of the basic instincts of human beings pertaining to sex and violence, so that people can be attracted towards the cinema. Since the financial investment is there, filmmakers also want that the cost can be earned and the profits can also be made, and therefore, whereas a writer can afford that the novel is not exactly read or even enjoyed by the majority of the people, the writer can always target a limited few, the select few, the elite group or the group of his choice, the target audience. We find that these possibilities are by and large absent in the movie making business. The movie is based on the investment of a capital, and therefore, it works to gain certain profits, and therefore, we find that the glitz and glamour is a necessary part of the film medium, even though it might not be present in the novel necessarily. Since film is based on the visual, and therefore, if the glitz is there and a basic appeal to the primordial sensibilities of men towards sex and violence is there, then it can be expected that people would stare at the screen, and therefore, the investment can be capitalized on. These factors make the relationship between the novel and the film rather ambivalent. We have already seen that how these two forms are related, and at the same time they belong to different realms, and we find that the film critics have also taken up different perspectives towards it. And here I would quote Ingmar Bergman, the famous film critic, who says that film has nothing to do with literature. The character and the substance of the two art forms are normally in conflict. This idea of Bergman is duplicated by Mailer, who says that film and literature are as far apart as, say, cave painting and a song. However, there are some other major critics who think that the interdependence is a positive thing and has to be built on further. And I would particularly like to refer to Marshall McLuhan, the famous media critic, whose views we have already discussed in some of the preceding modules also. He says that there is a close relation, and I quote, between the real world of film and the private fantasy experience of the printed world. And he says that this experience of the private fantasy is indispensable to the Western acceptance of the film form, because film, both in its real form and its scenario or script form, is completely involved with book culture. So, Marshall McLuhan has clearly said that the film as a medium is deeply and intricately involved with the book culture, and the two cannot be understood if we dissociate them completely. These difference of opinions lead us to look further into the basic tasks and responsibilities of a novelist as well as a filmmaker as perceived by them. Maurice Beja had quoted two very interesting examples. He has referred to a statement by Conrad and also a statement by D.W. Griffith in one of his articles, and I would refer to Maurice Beja's arguments to make this point clearer. Conrad, in his preface to The Nigger of the Narcissus, which was published in 1896, has said that his task was to, by the power of the written word, to make you hear, to make you feel, and I quote, it is before all to make you see that and no more, and it is everything. So, Conrad has said that the task of a novelist, his own task as well as the task of a novelist, is to make the audience see certain things. This idea of making one see is also duplicated in Griffith's statement when he says, and I quote, the task I am trying to achieve is above all to make you see. So, we find that a famous novelist and a famous filmmaker do agree as far as their version of basic responsibilities of their medium is concerned. But this is exactly the point where film and novel join as well as part company. So, we find that a movie assumes an affective relationship between the captive artist and receptive audience, and even though the novelist and the film director may have common intentions in their attempt to make us see certain things, we find that the contrasts of making us see something through the written word by their appeal to our conceptual capabilities and by making us see something on the basis of a visual which is available to us on the screen would always be there. So, we find that as far as the basic understanding of their tasks is concerned, the novelist and the filmmaker work in consonance. The function of a novelist is to reveal the hidden life at its source, as E.M. Forster has said. And we have also seen that the 20th century novelists, at the time when filmmakers were borrowing from the realist traditions of the 19th century novelists, the novelists of the 20th century were struggling to somehow present the non-verbal experience with the help of the words. So, we find that so many stylistic techniques were developed in the early half of the 20th century by literary authors like James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, and also by D.H. Lawrence, when they were grappling how to present the flux of time, how to present the emotions which run deeper into the psyche of the people with the help of narrative techniques. And therefore, we find that they had started to talk about the internal time, the dichotomy between the chronological, the clock time and the internal time, and then they had tried to develop the stream of consciousness technique to make us realize the inner goings on of a character's personality. But still we have to concede that novel basically is a discursive form. It is based in time. In contrast, we find that a film is based in space. So, if a novel is based in time and a film is based in space, we find that certain differences are to be there. The novel works in time and therefore, it can have several tenses. The film does normally have only a present tense with its as a basis, a point which I would explain later on. The rendition of the mental states, whether it is a memory, a dream or an imagination, is done sometimes better through language, because language, the words can detail an experience. On the other hand, a thought cannot be explained with the help of words only in the medium of words. It has to be presented through an image combined with words or in the absence of words, and it is to be perceived by the viewer. So, we find that these two basic differences of perceptions lie behind the basic difference of approach in these two mediums of expressions. So, we find that in the medium of films, visuals entrap a person even to the exclusion of sounds and words. Sometimes we find that either the dialogue or an individual sound becomes meaningless, and it is only the visual which suggests the meaning. It entraps a person. Also, there are times in a movie where the individual actor takes control, and it is the face of an individual in the absence of words which tries to project a particular image. So, a spoken word is also attached to the spatial image which is presented in a film. And therefore, we find that since these two mediums are basically different, the question of superiority should be considered as being redundant and irrelevant. We have to accept them as two independent and different art forms which may be enriched by each other, but ultimately they remain absolutely independent. An interesting aspect which we have to remember in the context of the novel as well as the film is that the precise definitions of these two genres are absent. We can try to define them approximately, but the basic differences in these two art forms also include this incapability of us to define them with certain precision. The role of technology is important in the production of a novel, but it also has importance as far as the making of a film and the viewing of a film is concerned. We have seen that how with the introduction of different technologies, the art forms have also changed shape. The novel as an art form has changed. It was started because of the intervention of a technology. Without the printing technology, novel as a genre would have been impossible. And now we find, as we would discuss later on, also we are moving in the direction of different developments in it. But the development in any medium which uses words only, in the context of technological development, is slow and it takes time, because it is related with the reading habits of a culture of an individual also. On the other hand, in the medium of films, in the medium of cinema, we find that the intervention of technology is immediate, and that is why we find that the way we look at a movie, the way we understand and respond to a movie is also changing. Now, we have different type of viewerships now. We do not have only those films where one has to go to the film theater and watch it in isolation and darkness. We find that with the introduction of TV, the personal computers and mobile phones, the way we look at a movie, the way we perceive these images has also changed. So, the conditions in which the film is viewed and is responded to have changed, and therefore, we find that the spaces which a movie used to occupy has also changed. These aspects we will discuss later on when we will discuss the trends of media in the 21st century. So, because of the visual appeal, it is suffice to say at this moment a film comes very close to a dream, as becomes evident in this particular quote by Jameson. The psychological implications of these two art forms are also significant, because both can have a cathartic effect. Catharsis, as we all know, is a purifying, or let us say a cleansing of our emotions. This was a term which was introduced by Aristotle in the context of the tragic drama and its influence on the audience. So, it cleanses us of our emotions, especially pity and fear. It is a release of emotional tensions as after an overwhelming experience that restores or refreshes the spirit. It has a significant role in literature as well as in psychological theories also. To a certain extent, we can say that the cathartic impact also depends on the receptivity of the audience, but we can safely say that the secondary world which is created by the film, the alternate world which is created by a film, allows us what can be termed as a substitute gratification. Literature also requires a participation on the part of the viewer, but let us say that in comparison to a film, the participation which literature or a novel requires from the audience is greater, the involvement is greater, it goes to a longer time duration also. So, we find that both mediums can also have a cathartic effect on the audience. When we try to adapt a novel or a story in a film, then certain changes are bound to occur. We have already referred to certain constraints which lie behind the making of a film. For example, it being a team effort, the constraints of money, etc. are there. Another constraint to which I would like to refer in this slide is the time constraint, which compels the filmmaker to do a lot of pruning in terms of the depiction of the story. At the same time, we find that films can be made again and again on the same theme, on the same novel, but the novel cannot be rewritten. Once a novel has been written, it is complete in itself. We can have different understandings or different versions, but unlike them, we find that films can be made again and again, and therefore, the same story may have different interpretations also. For example, novels like Pride and Prejudice, Robin Hood, War and Peace, Devdas, Anna Karenina have been filmed again and again, and every time we find that the versions communicate a story, an emotion which is slightly different from the other. I would particularly refer to Pudovkin's treatment of Gorky's famous novel Mother. Gorky's Mother was based on the emotions of a mother whose only son was involved in revolutionary activities in the Tsarist Russia. Pudovkin had initially made a silent movie on Gorky's novel. Later on, we find that the soundtrack was attached, but in these two versions and in the subsequent versions, film versions which were made on the same novel, we find that a difference of approach is clearly discernible. In a way, we can say that Coleridge's secondary imagination comes into play. Coleridge has suggested that the primary imagination which all of us have enables us to perceive something clearly, but the secondary imagination according to Coleridge is the poetic imagination. It is what enables us to connote different meanings. So, this connotative meaning has been termed as a secondary imagination by Coleridge, and it is the secondary imagination which comes into play as far as the treatment of a novel by a filmmaker is concerned. So, here let us say that a novel is viewed by a filmmaker in a particular light, and that filmmaker tries to enact that individual understanding of a novel on a screen. There are two different modes of consciousness also, which I would take up after a couple of more slides. So, we find that how the time itself is presented in a novel and how the time is presented in a movie sequence is depicted by certain formal laws, by the conventions of these two different mediums, which is also responsible for pruning, which is such a significant part of the adaptation of a novel into a movie. However, we would say that the aesthetic judgments which a viewer can have on a movie or which a reader can have towards a novel depend on the total ensembles. These are the inclusive whole, the collation of the formal and thematic conventions also. The way we look at these products is also different. When a novelist Conrad and a filmmaker Griffith were saying that their task is to make you see, then you they are referring to is also different. And herein we find that the sensibility of the audience as a whole also comes into the picture. So, the values and the structures, the myths and the expectations which the audience of Conrad had was different from the values, structures, myths and expectations which could be had by the audience of Griffith. Conrad as a novelist had a certain appeal to a small and middle class audience, and therefore, when he says that his task is to make you see, he is targeting the values and the structures and the expectations of a middle class audience only, which is limited, which is not a holistic, a complete way of addressing any issue, let us say. And on the other hand, when Griffith says that his task is to make you see, then as a filmmaker, he is addressing the mass audience, a collective people, and therefore, we would find that these two values which these two filmmakers want us to see, want their audience to see, are very different, because they are targeting different audience, and that is why the act of seeing becomes different and their understanding of the audience as you also becomes different. So, the expectations and demands of these two groups of audience turns the two art forms in very different, sometimes even opposite directions. So, when we look at the cinema in the novel as two art forms telling a story, then we also have to be aware of certain other aspects related with the filmmaking process. It is said that fiction is the ore which is minted in the story departments. So, fiction can be adopted by the story department of a filmmaker one, and sometimes we find that when the story or the script for a movie is being written, there can be direct as well as indirect influences. There may be an attempt to adapt the novel totally, or certain influences, certain aspects of the novel can be incorporated in the story, and both ways we find that the storyline is benefited. We also have to say that the movies which have been based on novels so far have been artistically and financially successful. If we look at the percentage of novels which have been adapted for high budgeted pictures, then this percentage is more in comparison to the adaptation of novels for low budget films. So, we can say that the adaptation of novel as a film medium is perhaps a costly business, because it involves a lot of detailing also. Many novels which have been turned into a film have also been awarded with covetous prizes, and very often we find that Pulitzer Prize winner novels and write-ups have been turned into movies. For example, Ellis Adams to All the King's Men. So, there is a certain connection between the success of these two mediums. Most of the time we have seen that the novels which have been successful as a particular art form have also been turned into a successful movies later on. At the same time, we find that the art form of the cinema also influences novels in many ways. The obvious connection lies in the tie-in sales of the novels. If a film becomes popular, we find that the people become curious to know about the novel also on which a picture has been based. We know, and studies and records tell us, when David Copperfield appeared on screen, many libraries ordered new copies of this novel. When the movie On Good Earth was released, we find that the sale of this novel was boosted by 3000% in a week. When Wuthering Heights was released, the novel also sold its 7 lakh copies. When the first version of Pride and Prejudice came out, we know that over 1 million copies of the novel were sold. The same is true about Moby Dick, War and Peace, and of late, after the latest elections of the US president, when Trump became victorious, there was a sudden boost in the sale of 1984 by George Orwell, because people might have tried to look at certain similarities between the two. However, when most of the readers approach the novel after having seen the movie, their obvious reaction is beautifully summed up by Jean-Paul Sartre. They feel that the book appears as more or less a faithful commentary on the film instead of being the other way round. So, film versions of the novels merely establish the fact of the reciprocity of content, not the aesthetics, which can be different also. They also provide statistical data, which is not criticality of comparison, and mutational processes in the filmmaking are also overlooked completely. The mutational processes, the mutations which are there in terms of the storyline of the novel, in terms of the characters, in terms of the thematic motives, are often ignored. They are often ignored by our judgmental attitudes, by the use of the expletives like this movie is true to the spirit of the book, or it is incredible how they have butchered the novel. But let us say that certain compulsions are there which suggest that deviations from the original novel story are permissible. For example, the length of the novel, the length of the story which is there in the novel can be pruned or has to be pruned, because unlike a novel, film has a limitation of time. Sometimes certain scenes can also be not visualized perhaps very effectively. So, extent of variation will vary directly in terms of the respect one has for the original. If the filmmaker wants to keep the story intact, we find that most of the time film is very close to the original novel. So, taking liberties, however, does not necessarily impair the quality of the movie, as we have seen in these two Bollywood movies, Padmavati and Bajirao, where there is a lot of deviation from the original stories, but the quality of a film is there, it has not suffered. So, we find that when the medium of expression is changed from a linguistic to the visual one, the differences are there, and the end products of the novel and film represent two different aesthetic genres. Each is autonomous and characterized by unique and specific properties of their own. So, when I say that they are characterized by unique properties of their own, what are they? There are two basic properties of these two mediums which I would like to refer to here. They are the two different modes of consciousness and the treatment of time inbuilt in these two art forms. We find that novels often move to depict the inner feelings, the hidden emotions, the suppressed emotions of mankind. And particularly in the beginning of the 20th century, there has been a definite movement from action to inward thought. Majority of the novels are moving very specifically from external action to internal debating of the experiences. However, in order to present the non-verbal experiences and emotions, they are faced with certain verbal limitations. Words help us to imagine those experiences variously and vicariously, but this understanding is also highly subjective, and they hope that the imagination of the reader would be able to substitute for the verbal lacuna, which is of course there in the novel, because whenever they are trying to depict through the medium of words a non-verbal phenomena or a non-verbal experience, it is bound to be there. So, readers, when they read a novel or a story, construct a conceptual image of things, of feelings, of concepts, of experiences, of structures, etc., on their reading of verbal stimuli. But these conceptual images become a part of a reader's consciousness in the same manner in which these images are a product of a reader's past experiences. So, they are highly subjective. Contrarily, we find that the images in films are externalized in space, and these conceptual images, which are difficult to project with the help of verbal stimuli, can be presented with the help of the facial expressions of the people. As the researchers of Professor Birdwhistell of the University of Pennsylvania tell us that human face has an immense capability to depict the emotions. So, we find that the medium of the film has a definite edge over the novel in the portrayal of a non-verbal experience without taking a recourse to the words. At the same time, we find that in the movies, the dreams and memories are presented in special terms. A film cannot show the thought directly, and therefore, it leads us to infer a particular thought by arranging certain external signs for our visual perceptions or through dialogues. The dialogues take the help of words, and at the same time, they are based on the paralinguistic capability of the actors and actresses to present a particular emotion. Without a paralanguage, we find that the linguistic delivery, or let us say the verbal delivery of a dialogue, will not be effective. And at the same time, films are dependent to a large extent on the arrangement of certain other external signs for our visual perception. So, the pictorial representation of dreams and memories becomes a challenge and may often be disappointing in the movies. The spatial representation of non-spatial experience is done with certain techniques and conventions, which I would also discuss in detail in the next module. But let us say that in order to remember the past conversations, etc., or in order to project the good times or the bad times, one can balloon a separate image into a frame. For the daydreaming sequences, there may be superimposition of certain images, or in order to show old snapshots, one can even clear the frame completely. So, these devices as cinematic conventions have grown, and they become their attempt to render the conceptual consciousness as far as the statement of a particular emotion is concerned. The treatment of time is also different in the novel and in the film. As I have referred to earlier, in the first half of the 20th century, the novelists were grappling with the projection of the inner goings on of a character's personality. So, they debated about different types of time and how to represent the time flux also. So, they talked about the chronological time, the psychological time or the internal time, and the French word they used for it is the re. So, we find that this difference between the external time and the internal time, and this idea of time as a flux was presented with different stylistic techniques, including the stream of consciousness technique. So, a novel, let us say, has 3 different tenses, right? It has 3 different tenses, whereas film only has 1 tense. The chronological time in novel exists on 3 primary levels. That is the chronological duration of the reading of a novel, we can read a novel within a day, or let us say we can take 6 months to 2 years to finish a novel maybe. There is a chronological duration of the narrator's time, how much time the novelist takes to write a particular novel. And in the duration of those years of research, those years which have undergone in the life of a particular novelist, we find that the perceptions can also change, the linguistic capabilities can also change. And at the same time, we find that reader has to be conscious of the chronological span of the events as they are being presented in a novel. So, when we look at the chronological duration of the narrator's time, we find that there is a durational lag between art and life, but it has been compensated in the medium of film with the help of technology, because technology has a certain immediacy. So, we find that one of these levels has been omitted in the film. The chronological duration of the reading and the chronological span of the events are retained in the film also, but the chronological duration of the narrator's time has been done away with, because it is the camera which is the narrator, not an individual. And therefore, we find that the ranges of the first level of chronological duration of the reading are also fluid. They are decided by the duration of the film. A film can have a duration of 2 hours, or it can be a short web based film having a duration of 10 minutes only. So, it becomes fixed. So, the chronological duration of the reading in the context of a movie has also become fluid and in a certain way fixed also. So, duration of film is limited, whereas we find that the duration of reading a novel is very different. We can read it in a hurried manner or in a leisurely manner, but it is the sense of the passage of time which is crucial in films, because a novel does not have any limitations in terms of pages, and it can have a long chronological span of events. But if the same long span of chronological events has to be depicted in a movie, we find that it has to develop its own techniques and conventions to present that. So, novel can afford a density because the reader would live with it longer. As we go on reading a novel for several months or several days, we find that it becomes a part of our psyche. A novel therefore can also afford diffusions. A novelist can describe certain other things also which may not necessarily be a part of the story, but a film has to economize everything. We can stop reading a novel, we can thumb back it, we can flip ahead at our own pace, we can pick it up again after a gap of, let us say, 6 months. But as far as the watching of a film is concerned, the pace is controlled by the projector, by the screen. It is there, and if we have to see it, then the duration is fixed by the projector or the screen. So, the fictional time is very different from the film time. In a film, conventions have grown that govern quantity effect and the way the quantity affects the end product. So, then the pruning also becomes important when we look at the projection of a movie or the projection of a story in the medium of film from this perspective. How much of the novel can be contained in a novel? Count of Monte Cristo in fact has been taken up barely 5% as far as the film version is concerned. The density of the description of the novel has been left out. There are film versions of the novel Anna Karenina starring Vivien Leigh and Ralph Richardson, and in this film version we find that the entire story of Levin and Kitty has been left out, which is a major thematic motive of the novel. So, such quantitative deletions alter the original novel. Still we find that when we look at the film adaptation of a novel, it is ultimately the qualitative rather than the quantitative differences that militate against film adaptations of the novel. The concept of the psychological time and the internal time has been there in the criticism of the novel in the beginning of the 20th century. So, this particular idea has been presented by various novelists in various ways. They have presented it in their critical writings. They have also tried to incorporate these techniques and methods in their own novels also. The phrase the psychological time or the internal time or Dere was for the first time used by William James in his book Principles of Psychology, published in 1869, and we find that in the beginning of the 20th century it had a major impact on the novelists. So, words are substituted in a film by the action. So, the action can be presented in a slow motion because the words are not there and everything has to be communicated with the help of the movements, with the help of the images. Then the picture can also develop in a slow motion, and we find that this particular aspect had been used during the era of the silent movies, particularly in the Charlie Chaplin movies. So, in a film, conflict and time are in constant motion, and no previous art form had such graphic effects which are now available to the making of a film. And we find that technological developments have enabled filmmakers to ignore the sequence of space and time, and at the same time they also have certain other help in the form of music and dialogues, and we find that each shot also has a particular context. Every shot takes its meaning both from the preceding shots and the future expectations, and at the same time the soundtrack and the music in the background provides a complex system of counterpoint. So, in a way we find that these are the non-verbal substitutes for the techniques which were used by the novelists from time to time. So, we find that films unfold in a perpetual present. They still have to take help of special effects or certain definite conventions which we would discuss in the next module in order to express past and future in a convincing manner. So, we find that different cinematic devices and conventions have been developed to portray that. Sound in a movie is always to be treated as a secondary advantage. It does not challenge the primacy of the spatial image. The sound is important, the dialogue delivery, the dialogue itself, the words which are used in the dialogue as well as the paralanguage which is used for the delivery are important, but they do never challenge the primacy of the sound. So, therefore, we find that it is always the image of the face of a star which has primacy over the sound of her or his voice. So, ultimately it is the image which is important in a movie. So, film comes closest to rendering the flux of time in comparison to any other non-verbal art form. If we take up the painting or the sculptures, we find that in comparison to that, films are much more capable to render the flux of time. So, film has attached special images to words, and therefore, in good films and with good actors, image and words are inextricably fused, enabling us to intuit the Dere or the internal time. So, we have seen what are the challenges in the adaptation of the novel into the medium of film. In our next module, we would discuss some of the techniques which have been developed by the art of cinematography to enable themselves to present the flux of the time as well as to present the spatial images convincingly. Thank you.